Good morning and welcome. This is Cheche, the show where opinion counts, live on Citizen TV. I'm your host, Udwaka Nemo. Now, the words credibility and peace are in heavy rotation this election season, and they feature in the theme of the National Conference on Election Preparedness that the IBC is holding at the moment. Delegates include the government, political parties, civil society, and the private sector. And they're considering issues such as the voter register, security, the legal framework, civic and voter education, and much, much more, all with the goal of ensuring legitimate and acceptable results. Well, two of the participants at the conference are Catherine Muma, a Constitution, Human Rights and Gender lawyer. She's also a former commissioner of the Constitution Implementation Commission, and Mule Musau, the National Coordinator of the Elections Observer Group, or ELOG. As always, we have the panel of Mutegi Njau and Charles Odhiambo, both of Royal Media Services. And so, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the show. And so, Mule, I'll start with you to help us unpack some of the words we're using in relation to the elections. Credible. What does credible mean in this context?
Well, first, thank you for having me in this particular show. From our understanding as observers, when we talk about credible elections, we are looking at elections which pass the test in terms of a number of things. And I'll use the words of a local lawyer who defined elections as an exam. I mean, the way you want to look at elections as an exam. Once you get 51%, the one who gets 51% and the one who gets 99% have passed the exam. However, of course, now the level of credibility in terms of what would you rather want. Do you want to see you getting 99%, or do you want to hang around 51%? So, talking about credibility, I would be saying, do we have a number of processes which are in place? We have a legal framework which is in place. Are we ensuring that this law, everything is above board in the first place? Are we ensuring that to the best of our ability we can be able to meet the timelines which have been set to ensure that we enfranchise the voters to participate in the process? Because nobody will score 100% when it comes to elections. So the credibility factor for me is, first, let's look at the voters, because the elections are about the people. Do we give them enough information to participate in this process? If we don't, then are they credible? Does the management body, the IEBC, which is in charge of managing this particular or running the particular election, are they conducting themselves according to the laws which are in place and according to the procedures which have been put there by the members of the public, through, of course, the public documents that we have? So you're looking at a number of factors, including from the legal framework, the management of the election itself, and the actual voter, whether that voter can actually be able to participate legitimately in the process. That is what I would qualify as credible, as a credible election.
Do you have anything to add to credibility?
My view is that credibility is about meeting the minimum standard set in the Constitution about the right to choose your representatives. And that is the free and fair. The Constitution talks about the right to participate in a free and fair election. And in Article 38, it actually makes it a right to participate. Casting a vote, participating as a candidate are rights entrenched within the Constitution. So to what extent have we put in place the administrative and other structures to facilitate the faithful delivery of the enjoyment of those rights? The right to participate in a free and fair. Is it fair for the citizen who's going to cast their vote? Is it fair for the candidates who are participating? And is it free in that manner? Okay. That's the standard in my view.
So what about peace? Because we're hearing a lot about peaceful elections, and of course that comes from our history of contestation, violent contestation of elections. What do we mean when we say peace? And are we talking about credibility versus peaceful? Are we having to choose one or the other?
I don't think credibility and peace are on the opposite sides. Actually, they both must be in place. So one, we must be aware of our past and know that we are a society that is full of suspicion with each other. We are a very polarized society. and very few small things triggers into violence, and you could see what happened even in the campaigns. If you could call those as mini elections, I don't know whether they are the major elections in Kenya, you can see how much even localized tension was there during these primaries. So what we are talking about is how can we achieve that environment that enables competition without going for each other violently.
And just to add very quickly on just on the issue, first I would weight credibility higher than peace, because I think credibility of an election leads to peace in terms of an election, because we want to see a fair process, like Catherine has said. You want to see a fair process, a just process. If you get a just process where everybody feels they've been involved and everything is fair, chances therefore of conflicts arising from that are minimal, and we need to avoid the situation where, and you remember I think in the last election, where the accept and move on thing, where you're talking about.
I'll come to that, because there's this argument that championing peace means that you're asking people to to ignore mismanagement of polls, therefore accept and move on. Yes,
there is that fog which is created by just peace messaging, that are we just then accepting this for the sake that we do not want to see violence happening? I think it would be more prudent if there were credible processes, if we follow the law, if we ensure that the management of these elections was very transparent, was very predictable, in a manner that allows everybody to feel they participated in it. And every time you do that, even when you're in a classroom with students, and you ensure that everything is very clear for them in terms of what they are required, what is required of them, it becomes very easy for them to hold their peace as a result. And that's the same thing with the country and with elections, where we see very peaceful elections across the world, and if you do a study, you'll find that the processes are fairly transparent, the processes are fairly free, they enfranchise as many of their citizens, and the processes are very predictable, very clear. So in my view, have credible elections, have a credible infrastructure in place and framework, then that nearly automatically leads to peaceful elections. But I'm not saying that you cannot have very good elections and then violence coming afterwards.
I was going to come to that. I think we'll turn that on its head later. Hold your peace, Mutegi. Let's just go through some of the definitions, and then we can come and interrogate a bit further. So we'll come back to the lawyer for the legal definition, because we're looking for an acceptable and a legitimate result. Yeah. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that we can have acceptable but illegitimate results, or legitimate results that are unacceptable?
Legitimate is important. As I began by saying, the standard is set by the Constitution. We want people to exercise their constitutional rights. We want them to exercise it in a manner that meets the minimum of the Constitution, free and fair. So how we interpret free, how we interpret fair, determines whether it is legitimate to start with. Legitimate in the sense that if the Constitution accords me a right to cast a vote when I attain the age 18, but we don't put in place the necessary mechanisms, legal and administrative, to facilitate me to cast that vote, I have not cast that vote, and to a certain extent I have been excluded. So there is some sense of unacceptability, as you are. There is some sense of, even you can even talk about illegitimate, see, in the sense that not as many people as could have participated have participated. So if we exclude through that process, it is somewhat illegitimate. It might be acceptable in the sense that, and we do it all the time, there's so many people who don't have those IDs, I know now, who actually have been waiting to get those IDs and will not cast their votes. We will move on as if they're not part of this country. Nobody's addressing that issue. So we kind of accept that bad standard. It doesn't mean, and we move on, we will actually have results around that. But we must then decide, when it comes to at least the ones who will cast the votes, what are the minimum acceptable and non-acceptable standards that must apply as we move on. And we would have to define that, whether it is the processes, the actual logistical processes of the electoral process, whether it is the legal processes. And that's why I think you see a lot of back and forth cases in court where people imagine this particular process has not been done fairly. So we want to go and question its legitimacy, and we want it to be done in a proper way in order for it to be legitimate. So all of those things come in play, and there are a multiplicity of them in terms of all the processes, whether you're talking about voter education, registration, campaigns, party primaries, and as we go on.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with Catherine. I think legitimacy is totally prescribed within the legal framework. If we work within the definitions of the legal framework and the regulations and all the other administrative processes, that becomes legitimate. Acceptability, I see it in two levels. First, there is within that framework, if we are doing things according to the script, that is acceptable. But then there is also the other social nuances that now we have in terms of, and I think that's where Catherine comes in terms of the standards that need to be agreed upon. What does it mean? We saw, for instance, in the party nomination processes, and we raised this within our enterprise in terms of election observation, and we said that yes, we saw very many shambolic processes happening within that process. But then there also a factor that people just, as soon as a result is announced, quite a number of candidates, the first instinct is to reject it. The first instinct is just not to accept those results, despite whether irrespective of whether the processes were actually rightly followed. And we know in many of the occurrences, actually it was not followed. But that's where the problem is. So there's also a social nuance to the acceptability that, as Kenyans, perhaps we also need to define further beyond running a credible process, a legitimate process according to the frameworks that we have agreed upon within the laws. Then do we also have another aspect where you say, if our person is not the one who is elected, then we cannot be able to accept the results nonetheless. Because you see, the consequences of both the non-acceptances is nearly the same. If there's a group which says we will not accept these results despite the fact that the processes have been followed or the right procedures have been followed, then we may end up with the same consequence in which there is a dispute, and that could even result into electoral violence.
We need to look at the way Kenyan voters behave, but we'll do that a bit later in the program. Mutege, I cut you short.
I wanted to ask the two of them, as we stand today, what is your biggest worry in terms of those processes? What has happened and what has not happened? What's the biggest worry we have as a country?
Personally, three things. One, voter register, because I think if we do not get an accepted voter register, we may not even have the elections. So this process of the KPMG report needs to be interrogated. The report which has come out, the verification process, we have seen a fairly small number of people, of Kenyans, that are actually verifying results, and from that small sample we're also seeing quite a number of problems in terms of people finding their details in that register. I think that is a process which must be cleaned very thoroughly before the elections. That's number one. Number two is, of course, electronic process and the systems schemes. Again, we must have a very an interrogation of those electronic gadgets to ensure that they are working, because again, that's in election observation, we call technologies a black box, especially from the public eye, because who knows what goes in. We know what goes in because we are voting, but and we also know what comes out because there's supposed to be an output, but what happens inside that process becomes a black box, and therefore there's a need for a transparent process, which brings me to the third point, which is voter education, because again, you disenfranchise, as Catherine has talked about this, you disenfranchise populations and masses across this country by not giving them enough information. From the information that we also had collected between March and May, we had seen that initially there was less than 50% of the constituencies were receiving voter education, whether from the IEBC, civil society, or any other person.
50 out of 50%.
Less than 48% was the highest that at one point. Although now we are seeing the trend starting to change, because now IEBC is starting to get into the field. So that is a major problem, because when voters do not get information in terms of how they participate in the process or understanding of the process, then that automatically disenfranchises them, and that's one of the reasons why we saw in 2013 the rejected ballots competing with some presidential candidates, beating some of them.
Catherine, your concerns?
I agree with his concerns, but I would add the integrity of the officers that are actually going to carry out the votes. I don't mean IEBC commissioners, actually the actual staff who are going to carry out, and they are recruited from, some of them will be recruited, are being recruited from members of the public. They are not permanent staff of the IEBC. Those are the ones that actually are manipulated, are paid to manipulate processes, and those are the ones.
You mean the returning officers? Or presiding officers?
No, all of them. In fact, the returning officer gets after. If you watched the, I was following up with the party primaries, and there are people whose entire set of agents were bribed and they disappeared. So, and if that happens, we have staff who are not being loyal to the task they are supposed to carry out, whether you are an agent, whether you are a returning officer, whether you are one assisting in the voting. Those are the ones that are.
So what should be done? What should be done about this stuff?
We can discuss that a little later. And the other one is the campaigns. Currently, there is a lot of fear-mongering. There is a lot of bullying. You can see the independent candidates are being bullied. They are actually provided for in the constitution. But you can see the leaders of parties are actually bullying independent candidates, trying to stigmatize them, trying to make them look as if what they're doing is not right.
Or buying them.
Whatever the case, in my view, that's an interference with the electoral process, and it's not acceptable.
These social nuances that you are referring to, Mule, and now I bring it to you, Catherine, is it because there is no absolute provision in our laws that make people have this fear for the unknown and perception that it must be us winning? If we don't win, then it's not fair. Perception that electoral officials could be bought or compromised and such like things. Is it that we don't have enough laws?
We have more than enough laws, save for a very few areas that we have not covered properly, which is fine, because no law is ever perfect. We have so many laws and regulations. Our problem is that we don't respect the rule of law. We have the laws for the record. In fact, sometimes I call them model laws because we have them there, but when we come to practice, we want to do our own things. So because we are in the culture of not respecting the laws, nobody is expecting that the laws will be respected. That's why our default mechanism is to expect a violation of the law. That's why people are worried, and it happened in party primaries. Tell me which party actually followed the law. That is our default mechanism.
I think your findings corroborated that.
Yes.
So if we have findings that say that there are all these violations of the law and nothing has been done to check that, why should Kenyans believe that we are prepared for the election and that we can have credible, acceptable and legitimate results?
Good question. Actually, yesterday I was on the panel that talked on the legal issues, and I said the problem is not the laws. The problem is the institutions that have been put in place to implement those laws. Why are we not enforcing? I'm sure you have seen a few election offences. If you read the Election Offences Act, you can pick, anybody can pick a number of violations.
Can you give us examples?
I can give you the examples myself, because at least I'm observing the elections. We have voter bribery. That's one of the most widespread offense which is out there. We have violence and intimidation, and all those are offenses very clearly stipulated within the Elections Offences Act. So there are things that there is also the participation of public officials.
Public officers, abuse of public.
We saw, for instance, in our report, 47% of the constituencies, public officials are participating in campaigns and political activities.
And they're pretending.
These things are very... We saw Harambes being conducted in 48% of, again, the constituencies. Now, this is very clear, even in terms of the public, from a public knowledge point of view. There was a lot of debate, and which was highlighted by the media, around the Harambee issue when it was banned. Now, it's still happening all over the country. So those institutions and the support categories, the institutions, ORPP, for instance, remember the issue of the political parties not even having a register.
ORPP now is the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties.
Yes, Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. We know they're supposed to be having copies of these registers. How come they were not availed around a particular time? Or how come Lucy Ndungu did not make noise about the fact that we had members of political parties who are using IBC registers to participate in the elections? So these things, the institution, DPP, the Director of Public Prosecution, NCIC, the Cohesion Commission, which is in charge of issues about hate speech and such, they are supposed to be functional, especially around this time that we are preparing ourselves towards elections. And one of the things, a deterrence mechanism. You know, you're not going to arrest everybody in this country who is receiving a voter, a bribe. But we know that action on a certain number of individuals becomes a deterrent to others who are doing the same in other parts of the country. And therefore that needs to be addressed. I just quickly wanted to answer something that Mutegi raised in terms of the training of the officials, and I'm saying one of the things that can be done in that respect is that, one, we need to see a very transparent process of that recruitment, because we can blow whistles. People can blow whistles on people they think they are not of integrity, even participating in a public process like the IBC process. You don't want them to be, you don't want a presiding officer of somebody in the village who is very well known to be a NASA person or to be a Jubilee person.
But the reverse can also be true, that if you're a person of integrity and I intend to buy my way out of whatever predicament I find, that I will, falsely accuse you so that I can get more pliable agents. So how do we deal with that?
And that's what I'm saying. When you make it a public process, there'll be push and pull factors and from different quarters. There'll be people who will be saying, woodwork is this, and there'll be other people who will be also watching for you. And there are the other institutions who may also come in to watch or to interrogate the process further. The observers will want to find out what is the perception of woodwork in this particular process. The training aspect of it, again, is something that we can be able to make contributions. Civil society can be able to make contributions towards the same in terms of interrogation of whether that person is actually following the codes of conduct, and action, especially where there are lies or there is mischief on those particular officials even before the election. That would send a statement out there that
Mulla, these things sound ideal. Are there jurisdictions that really dispense this as you people are putting it?
Let me tell you, in most of the best practices across the world, and one of the things every time I always speak examples of some countries that practice some very interesting things, like Mexico, for instance, where even minutes of the commission, Chabukati, are shared with members of the public. People try, the election process is supposed to be a people process. Now, when it is obscured, or people are obscured from seeing that process, that's where issues about trust come in. Because when people don't know what is going on behind the curtains, then they start asking questions and create perceptions. But when it is open to them, this is how we are recruiting, this is how we are training, this is how we are testing the systems, this is how we are verifying the processes, this becomes much more easier for consumption of the public, and becomes easy to sell in terms of a process.
Okay, so we have to take a break now. This is Cheche, and we're live on Citizen TV. The IBC is holding a national conference on election preparedness. So our question to you is this: do you think the IBC is ready for the general election? Our SMS number is 22422, or you can reach us on Twitter. The hashtag is Cheche.